How would you compare whatever's going on in the world today with the crucible of World War II, right? Because we over-dramatize everything. It's always the worst, right? Very pessimistic culture, I'd argue, today, which is odd. How would you characterize that?
Well, I think what's so encouraging about Lewis's story is that he's watching the disintegration in so many ways of the civilization around him, right? The assault on Christian values, the agnosticism, the fascism, totalitarianism. And what he's going to do, along with Tolkien and others, he's going to push back through his vocation, through his sense of calling. And he's going to tell stories that really embody the best of the human spirit, embody these deeply Christian ideas, nobility, virtue, faith, sacrifice for a noble cause. All those things are in his works. So he is consciously and deliberately pushing back against the moral cynicism, the agnosticism, the totalitarianism of his age, not knowing what kind of impact he was going to have, just faithful at his task.
Okay, that's super important. Let's go deeper there. So right now we're living in a postmodern, let's call it postmodern, nihilistic, narcissistic age. And it comes from our culture, right? Our culture is, I'd argue it's rotten to the core. What can we learn from C.S. Lewis about storytelling and how to tell the truth to push back against this?
Yeah, it's a terrific question, Mike. I mean, Lewis understood the power of story to communicate deep moral truths, spiritual truths that we otherwise might not want to pay attention to. And the phrase that Lewis used at one point was using stories to sneak past those watchful dragons. The prejudices.
Oh, it's so good. What were the watchful dragons watching for?
Yeah. The idea of truth and beauty and goodness and grace, all those concepts, the dragons were ready to destroy those things. So Lewis is using narrative, the power of myth, to sneak past the watchful dragons. His first book, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask you, can you give us an example of a story that did that?
Well, in 1938, the first of his space trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, that story, that science fiction story, is really about the fall, the biblical fall. And what Lewis realized was, even though the book was favorably reviewed in 1938, the reviewers didn't understand that it was about the fall. There was that kind of biblical illiteracy. So he's sneaking in, smuggling in these great truths through a science fiction story.
Wow. And of course, Aslan as well, and many other examples.
Yeah.
What was his goal with all of that? Did he have a stated, expressed long-term goal, or was he just living in the moment, or what would you say?
Walter Hooper, who was Lewis's personal secretary, he's still around, Walter Hooper, is 89 years old. Wow. My film team and I interviewed him in Oxford last year. Walter Hooper said, as he got to know Lewis in the last months of his life, he was the most thoroughly converted man he'd ever met. In other words, Lewis's Christian faith, it just permeated everything about him, his scholarship, his friendships, his sense of calling. So I think at one level, his objective was to be the most faithful, creative writer he could possibly be. And it was just natural for him to embed in his stories, in his scholarship, his Christian outlook. So it wasn't an agenda per se, it just came out of him because of how Jesus, frankly, had changed his life.
Okay, so what do we do with that today? How do we use that as our model?
One of the things I think we have to keep in mind is Lewis did not work in isolation. He worked in a fellowship with others, in community with others. J.r.r. Tolkien, Charles Williams, Owen Barfield, these were the Inklings. These were the group of men, Christian men, who met together every week in Lewis's rooms, his academic rooms there in Magdalen College, and at the Eagle and Child Pub. They met every week, Mike, for over 20 years, faithfully. They never stopped meeting to critique each other's works. As Lewis said, we came to talk about literature, but always we talked about something better. So it was just an amazing group of who really helped each other become the scholars and the Christian thinkers that they became.
How did they challenge each other?
Well, they would read out loud each other's work. So Tolkien read virtually every chapter of The Lord of the Rings was read out loud to the Inklings, and then there was the critique. An honest, friendly, but honest and tough critique. Same for Lewis. with the Chronicles of Narnia. He read that out loud to the group. And can you imagine being in that room with those guys and submitting your little chapter, your next chapter installment to that group of Christian writers? Just astonishing.
Thanks for watching the Heritage Foundation's YouTube channel. With more than 500,000 members, we are the nation's largest conservative research and education institution. We believe the principles and ideas of the American founding are worth conserving and renewing. Please help us further our mission by subscribing to this channel and sharing our videos with your family and friends.